August 15, 1945. The sea was too calm for a day of surrender. The transport ship rocked gently against the dock at Guam, its hull scarred with rust and saltwater stains that told stories no one aboard wanted to remember. 23 Japanese women stood in two lines on the deck. Their uniforms, once crisp Imperial Army issue, now hung loose and wrinkled, darkened with sweat and the particular grime that comes from weeks without proper washing. The smell of diesel fuel mixed with brine, and beneath it all, the sharper scent of fear. Nakamura Yuki stood third from the front, her hands clasped so tightly that her fingernails left crescents in her palms. She was 24 years old, though she felt ancient. Her role had been communications, translating American radio intercepts, decoding messages that helped plot coordinates for artillery strikes. She had been good at her job, efficient. The officers had praised her penmanship, the way she could transcribe English words even when they crackled through static. Now, those same hands trembled. The American soldiers waiting on the dock wore uniforms that looked impossibly clean. Yuki had expected them to look monstrous. Propaganda posters had shown them with fangs, with red eyes, with hands ready to tear and violate. But these men looked tired, young. One of them couldn't have been more than 19, his helmet sitting slightly crooked on his head, his rifle slung loosely over his shoulder as if he had forgotten he was holding it. The gangplank groaned as it was lowered. The sound made several women flinch. A Japanese naval officer, the last remnant of their command structure, descended first. He walked with the stiffness of a man trying to preserve dignity in its complete absence. The American captain who met him at the bottom said something Yuki couldn't hear. They did not salute each other. The Japanese officer simply nodded and then gestured toward the women still standing on deck. The descent began. Yuki's feet felt disconnected from her body as she walked down the gangplank. Each step was a small act of will. The wood was sun-bleached and splintered, and through gaps between the planks she could see green water moving lazily below. For a moment, she imagined stepping through one of those gaps and simply disappearing into that water, dissolving into the current like ink from a pen. But she kept walking. The dock smelled of creosote and fish. American voices murmured around them, not shouting, not angry, just talking in that strange, flat accent she'd spent 2 years learning to decode. One soldier was smoking, the cigarette dangling from his lip as he watched them with an expression Yuki couldn't identify. Not hatred, not even curiosity. Something closer to sadness. They were led to a line of canvas-covered trucks. The woman in front of Yuki, Tanaka, who worked in medical logistics, stumbled slightly, and an American soldier reached out to steady her. Tanaka recoiled as if burned, her eyes wide with terror. The soldier withdrew his hand immediately, holding both palms up in a gesture of non-threat. "Easy," he said softly. "Just don't want you to fall." Tanaka stared at him with incomprehension so complete that Yuki felt it in her own chest, a tightening, a confusion that bordered on panic. This was not how it was supposed to happen. The ride to the camp took 40 minutes along a road that had been carved through dense jungle. Yuki sat on a wooden bench in the back of the truck, pressed between other women who maintained absolute silence. The canvas cover flapped in the warm wind, giving intermittent glimpses of green canopy and brilliant blue sky. Beautiful, obscenely beautiful. Yuki thought about all the men who had died under skies exactly this color and wondered if beauty was a form of cruelty.
The camp appeared gradually through the trees, a collection of Quonset huts and wooden barracks surrounded by chain-link fence. But the gate stood open. No guards pointed weapons at them. Instead, a handful of soldiers waited near a building with a red cross painted on its side, their postures relaxed, almost casual. The truck stopped. The American soldier who had tried to help Tanaka lowered the tailgate and stepped back, giving them space to climb down on their own terms. Yuki watched his face carefully, searching for the moment when the mask would drop, when the violence would begin. It didn't come. They were led to a barracks that smelled of fresh pine and disinfectant. Inside were rows of cots, Not bare metal racks, but actual cots with thin mattresses and folded blankets. On each cot lay a stack of clothes, simple cotton dresses, underwear, a towel, a bar of soap. An American officer entered, followed by a Japanese-American translator, a young woman in U.S. Army uniform whose Japanese carried the distinct accent of Hawaii. The officer was in his 40s, with gray threading through his hair and deep lines around his eyes. "You'll be staying here," the translator said, her voice gentle but professional. "Showers are in the building to the east. Mess hall is north. You're free to move around the camp during daylight hours. No one will harm you." One of the older women, Sato, who had been a senior administrator, spoke up, her voice brittle. "What about interrogation?" The officer looked at her for a long moment before responding. "We'll need to document everyone's name and role for processing. That's all. You're not here as suspects. You're here as people who need somewhere safe to be while we figure out what happens next." The translator's voice softened even further as she delivered these words in Japanese, as if she knew how impossible they would sound. "The war is over," the officer added. "That's not propaganda. Emperor Hirohito announced the surrender this morning. You can refuse to believe me if you want, but you'll see it's true soon enough." He left them then, the translator following. The door closed softly. No locks, no bars, just wood and silence. For several minutes, no one moved. Then someone began to cry, and the sound seemed to break whatever spell had held them frozen. Women sank onto cots, covered their faces, or simply stared at the clothes that had been left for them with expressions of profound disbelief. Yuki picked up the bar of soap. It was white, rectangular, and smelled faintly of lavender. She held it in both hands and tried to remember the last time she'd seen soap this clean, this new. 6 months? A year? She brought it to her nose and inhaled, and something in that simple scent made her eyes burn with tears she refused to let fall. The shower building had individual stalls with canvas curtains for privacy. The water ran warm, impossibly warm, and when Yuki stood under the stream, she watched dirt and sweat and salt spiral down the drain at her feet. She scrubbed her skin until it hurt, trying to wash away more than filth, knowing it was futile. The soap lathered thick and white, and she thought about all the things you couldn't wash away no matter how hard you tried. She emerged clean, but not cleansed, wearing a dress that fit reasonably well, her hair still damp and heavy down her back. The setting sun cast long shadows across the camp, turning everything golden and soft. Yuki walked slowly toward the mess hall, following the other women, feeling like a ghost moving through a world that had forgotten to notice her. The food was simple: rice, vegetables, some kind of meat stew, but there was plenty of it, served onto metal trays by soldiers who didn't meet their eyes, who moved with practiced efficiency born from feeding thousands of displaced people. Yuki carried her tray to a long table and sat between women who ate in silence, each wrapped in their own impossible thoughts. Halfway through the meal, the American officer from earlier entered the mess hall. He moved between tables, not saying much, just observing. When he reached our table, he paused. His gaze traveled across their faces, and Yuki saw something in his expression that made her throat constrict. It was grief. "I wonder," he said, and the translator appeared at his shoulder almost immediately. "If you'd be willing to answer a question, not for intelligence, not for records, just personally." The women stared at him. Several forks had frozen halfway to mouths. "Go ahead," Sato said, after a moment, her voice carefully neutral. The officer was quiet for several seconds, as if gathering courage. When he spoke, his voice was low, almost rough. "Do you think you could forgive us for what we've done?" The translator hesitated before converting the words to Japanese, as if she wanted to make sure she'd heard correctly. When she finally spoke, her voice wavered slightly. The silence that followed was absolute. Yuki felt the question land in her chest like a stone. She stared at this American officer with his grief-worn face and tried to make sense of what he'd just asked. Forgiveness. He was asking them, the defeated, the conquered, the ones who should be begging to forgive America. For what? For winning? For the firebombing campaigns that had turned cities into ash? For the 2 new bombs that erased Hiroshima and Nagasaki from the earth in blinding flashes of light? But even as these thoughts formed, Yuki felt something else rising beneath them. A memory of herself at a radio console, transcribing coordinates in neat columns, of officers using those coordinates to direct artillery and never asking what those numbers meant in terms of bodies, of homes, of children who would never grow old. "I don't understand," Tanaka whispered. The officer nodded, as if he'd expected this response. "Neither do I, honestly. But I've been thinking about it a lot lately, about forgiveness, about what we owe each other." He looked down at his hands, large hands, calloused and with scars across the knuckles. "I've killed people, directly and indirectly. Men who were probably no different than me, scared, following orders, trying to survive. And I don't know how to live with that. I don't know how any of us are supposed to live with what we've done to each other." The translator's voice had taken on a strange quality, as if she herself was being changed by the words she was speaking. "So I'm asking, because I don't know what else to do. Because maybe if you can forgive us, it means forgiveness is possible. And if it's possible, then maybe we're all not damned." He left without waiting for an answer, his boots heavy on the wooden floor. The women sat in stunned silence. Yuki's rice had gone cold on her tray, but she couldn't remember how to make her hands work to eat it. The question hung in the air like smoke, impossible to grasp, impossible to ignore. That night, Yuki lay on her cot and stared at the ceiling of the barracks. Around her, women breathed in various rhythms of sleep and wakefulness. Someone was crying softly, muffling the sound with her pillow. Someone else muttered in dreams, words too low to distinguish. Yuki thought about the officer's question, about forgiveness. She had been taught that Americans were devils, that they fought without honor, that they would rape and torture and destroy everything they touched. The propaganda had been constant, vivid, designed to eliminate any possibility of sympathy, and she had believed it because believing it made the war comprehensible, made her own role in it bearable. But today she had been treated with a gentleness that violated everything she'd been told. She had been given soap and privacy and food and safety, and now she was being asked to forgive, as if her forgiveness mattered, as if she was something more than a defeated enemy. It would have been easier to be hated, easier to be punished, because then the narrative would hold. We are the victims, they are the monsters, and suffering is simply what happens when good loses to evil. But this careful kindness, this grief-stricken request for absolution, it shattered the story completely. It forced Yuki to confront a more terrible truth, that there were no devils in this war, only people. People who had killed other people for reasons that seemed necessary at the time and which now, in the aftermath, felt hollow as empty shells. She thought about the coordinates she had translated, about the precision of her penmanship, about how easy it had been to transform human lives into numbers on a page. Could she forgive the Americans for their violence when she couldn't forgive herself for her own complicity? The question twisted in her mind like a knife. Days passed in strange suspension. The women moved through the camp like uncertain ghosts, testing the boundaries of their new reality. Some ventured to the camp library, a small room filled with books in both English and Japanese. Others sat in the shade of palm trees, staring at nothing, lost in thoughts they couldn't share. Yuki found herself drawn to the fence line at the eastern edge of camp, where the jungle pressed close and the air smelled of green growing things and decay. She would stand there in the late afternoon, watching light filter through the canopy, thinking about transformation and rot, and the way life insisted on continuing even in the presence of death. One afternoon, she found the young American soldier there, the one from the dock who had tried to steady Tanaka. He was sitting on the ground, his back against a post, smoking a cigarette and staring at the jungle with an expression of profound exhaustion. He noticed her and tensed slightly, as if preparing to leave. But then something in his posture relaxed. He took a long drag from his cigarette and spoke without looking at her. "You understand English?" Yuki hesitated, then nodded once. "Figures, you were communications, right? That's what they said." He exhaled smoke slowly. "I'm from Ohio, little town you'd never heard of. Before the war, I worked at my dad's hardware store, sold nails and hammers and paint. Simple stuff." He was quiet for a moment, then continued. "I killed a man once, up close, with a bayonet. It was at night, during a raid. He came around a corner and we both froze, and then training took over and He gestured vaguely with a cigarette. He was young, maybe 17. He kept trying to say something, but there was blood in his throat and it just came out as this gurgling sound. I stayed with him while he died, held his hand. Stupidest thing I've ever done, but I couldn't just leave him there alone." Yuki's hands were gripping the fence wires so tightly that it left impressions in her palms. "Point is, I don't know who he was. Don't know if he had a girl back home, or parents, or brothers. Don't know if he was cruel or kind or anything. I just know I killed him because he was wearing the wrong uniform. And I can't forgive myself for that. Can't even begin to figure out how." He finally looked at her then, and his eyes were wet. "So, when the captain asks if you can forgive us, I don't think he's really asking about us. I think he's asking if forgiveness is even real. If it's something that can actually exist in a world where people do what we've done to each other." He stubbed out his cigarette and stood, brushing dirt from his pants. "Sorry. Didn't mean to dump that on you. Just seemed like you might understand." He walked away, leaving Yuki alone with the jungle and her thoughts. That night, she dreamed of coordinates transforming into faces, of numbers becoming names, becoming people, becoming dust. She woke gasping, her dress soaked with sweat, her heart hammering against her ribs. In the darkness of the barracks, she heard Sato's voice, soft and careful. "Are you all right?" "No," Yuki whispered. It was the first honest word she had spoken in days. "None of us are," Sato replied. "I don't think we're supposed to be." A week after their arrival, the women were gathered in a large tent that served as a recreation area. The American officer, his name was Patterson, they'd learned, entered with the translator and several other soldiers. But this time, they carried boxes.
"We've been collecting letters," Patterson said through the translator, "from families in America whose sons or brothers or fathers were killed in the Pacific. These aren't official communications, just words from people trying to make sense of loss." He set the boxes on a table. "Some of these letters are angry. Some are grief-stricken. Some are both. But some of them, more than I expected, honestly, are asking the same question I asked you. Whether forgiveness is possible. Whether there's a way forward that doesn't just multiply the pain." Patterson pulled a single letter from the box, unfolded it carefully. This one's from a woman in California. Her son died at Saipan. She writes, I used to think I wanted revenge. I used to imagine Japanese mothers suffering the way I've suffered, but then I realized that their suffering wouldn't bring him back. It would just mean more mothers sitting in empty rooms holding photographs of children who aren't coming home. And I don't want that. I don't want anyone to feel this way. So I'm writing to say that I forgive them. Not because they deserve it, not because it makes the pain stop, but because I refuse to let this war claim my humanity too. The translator's voice broke slightly on the final sentence. Several women were crying openly now. Yuki felt tears on her own cheeks, but made no move to wipe them away. Patterson folded the letter with great care, as if it were something sacred. You don't have to read these if you don't want to. You don't have to respond to them. You don't have to feel anything about them. But they're here if you need them. If you want to know that grief doesn't always calcify into hatred. He left the boxes on the table and departed quietly, the soldiers following. For a long time, no one approached the table. Then Tanaka stood, walked slowly, and picked up a letter at random. She read it in silence, her lips moving slightly, then set it down and picked up another. And another. One by one, other women joined her. Yuki waited until sunset, when the tent was nearly empty. The boxes still sat on the table, now somewhat disorganized from being rifled through. She approached them as she might approach a wound, with caution, with the knowledge that looking would hurt, but with the understanding that some things needed to be witnessed. She selected a letter at random. It was written in careful English on lined paper, the handwriting slightly shaky. My name is Margaret Sullivan. My husband James was killed during the invasion of Okinawa. We were married for 6 years. We had a daughter, Emily, who just turned 5. She asks me every day when Daddy is coming home, and I don't know how to tell her that he never will. I'm writing this because I don't know what else to do with everything I'm feeling. I'm angry at everyone, at James for dying, at the Japanese for killing him, at the generals who ordered the invasion, at myself for not treasuring every moment we had together. But mostly, I'm just sad. So deeply sad that some days I can barely breathe. I saw in the newspaper that the war is over now, that Japan has surrendered, and I keep thinking about all the Japanese wives who are getting the same news I got, that their husbands aren't coming home. All the Japanese children who will grow up without fathers. And I know I'm supposed to feel satisfaction or justice or something, but I just feel sad for them too. Maybe that makes me weak. Maybe it means James died for nothing if I can't even properly hate the people who killed him. But I don't think he would have wanted me to become bitter. He was so kind. Even when he was scared, even when he was angry, he tried to be kind. So I'm writing to say that I forgive whoever killed him, not because they deserve forgiveness, maybe they don't, maybe no one does, but because holding on to hatred is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. And I've got a daughter to raise, and I can't raise her on poison. I hope you can forgive us too, for whatever we've done, for whatever pain we've caused. I hope all of us can find a way to be human again. Sincerely, Margaret Sullivan. Yuki read the letter 3 times, then carefully folded it and placed it back in the box. Her hands were shaking, her entire body was shaking. She walked out of the tent into the warm evening air. The sky was painted in shades of orange and pink, impossibly beautiful, and she thought about Margaret Sullivan's husband James lying dead on Okinawa, and about the young soldier from Ohio with blood on his hands, and about the American officer who carried grief in his eyes like a weight he could never set down. She thought about the coordinates she had translated and wondered if any of them had led to James Sullivan's death. The probability was small, the Pacific theater was vast, the war chaotic and scattered, but it was possible. It was always possible. And that possibility made her complicit in Margaret Sullivan's pain. The question came back to her. Could she forgive the Americans? But she realized now that was the wrong question, or at least not the only question. The real question was whether she could forgive herself, whether Margaret Sullivan could forgive herself for surviving when James didn't, whether the Ohio soldier could forgive himself for the 17-year-old boy who died gurgling in the darkness, whether Captain Patterson could forgive himself for whatever orders he had given, whatever violence he had authorized. Forgiveness, Yuki understood now, was not about erasure. It was not about forgetting what had been done or pretending that pain didn't matter. It was about acknowledging the full weight of suffering, both inflicted and endured, and choosing to remain human anyway. Choosing to believe that people were more than the worst things they had done, even when that belief felt like self-deception. It was the hardest thing she had ever tried to imagine doing. But the alternative was to remain frozen in hatred, to let the war continue forever in her heart, to transform herself into nothing but a monument to anger and pain. And she was tired of being frozen, tired of monuments, tired of war. That night, she found paper and a pen in the camp library. She sat at a scarred wooden table, staring at the blank page for nearly an hour before she began to write. To Captain Patterson. You asked us if we could forgive you. I have been thinking about this question constantly since you spoke it. At first, I thought it was a strange question, even insulting. We are the defeated. We are the ones who should be begging forgiveness. But I understand now that defeat and guilt are not the same thing, and that both sides carry guilt, even if the weight is not equal. I was a translator for the Imperial Army. I transcribed American radio transmissions. I provided coordinates that led to artillery strikes. I did this because I believed I was protecting my country. I believed Americans were monsters who needed to be stopped. Then I came here, and you treated me with kindness I did not expect and do not feel I deserve. You gave me soap and privacy and food and safety. And then you asked for my forgiveness, as if my opinion of you mattered, as if I was still fully human in your eyes.
This kindness is harder to bear than cruelty would have been. Cruelty I could understand. Cruelty would confirm everything I was taught. But kindness requires me to question everything, to see you as human. And if you are human, then so am I. And if I am human, then I must confront what I have done. I read a letter tonight from a woman named Margaret Sullivan. Her husband died at Okinawa. She writes that she forgives whoever killed him. I do not know if I provided coordinates that led to his death. The probability is small, but it is not zero. Can I forgive you? I do not know yet. I am not sure forgiveness is something that happens all at once. Perhaps it is something you choose again and again, day after day, even when your heart resists. But I will try. Not because you deserve it, and not because I deserve to be forgiven in return, but because I refuse to let this war take everything from me. I refuse to become nothing but anger and pain. I think perhaps that is all any of us can do. Refuse. Choose. Try. This is not absolution, for you or for me, but perhaps it is a beginning. Nakamura Yuki. She folded the letter and left it on Patterson's desk in the administration building,
then walked back to the barracks through darkness, broken only by starlight and distant lamps. 3 weeks later, they were transferred to a processing center in Yokohama to begin the long, complicated work of repatriation. The morning of their departure, Patterson stood by the trucks to see them off. When Yuki passed him, he pressed a small envelope into her hand. She didn't open it until she was on the transport ship, watching Guam recede into the distance. Inside was a single sheet of paper, with 2 words written in careful, practiced Japanese characters. "Thank you."
Below, in English, he had written more. "I don't know if forgiveness can heal what's been broken, but I know that without it, we're lost. Thank you for trying. Thank you for being brave enough to try." Yuki stood at the ship's railing, holding that letter, watching the Pacific stretch endlessly in all directions. The water reflected sky so perfectly that it was impossible to tell where one ended and the other began. She thought about coordinates and names and the infinite distance between them, about propaganda and truth, and the way one could masquerade as the other, about violence and kindness and how both could wound, though in different ways, about the young soldier from Ohio and Margaret Sullivan and Captain Patterson and all the millions of people who had been touched by this war, killed by it, broken by it, transformed by it. She thought about forgiveness as a kind of war itself, fought not with weapons, but with the slow, painful reconstruction of one's own capacity for empathy. A war without victory, only the daily choice to remain human in the face of everything that had tried to strip that humanity away. The letter grew damp in her hands from sea spray and tears she didn't try to hide. Around her, the other women stood in similar postures of grief and uncertainty, each carrying their own impossible weight. The ship cut through water that was too calm for what they'd survived, too blue, too beautiful. The war was over, but its ghosts would sail with them forever, not as enemies, but as witnesses to what they had been and what they had chosen, in the end, to become. In the distance, Japan waited. Home. The whether home was something you returned to or something you had to build again from nothing, Yuki did not yet know. She folded Patterson's letter carefully, placed it in her pocket over her heart, and turned her face toward the horizon. Behind her was Guam. Ahead was an uncertain future in a ruined country. But in her chest, fragile and painful as new bone, was the beginning of something that might, eventually, in time, become forgiveness. Not for him, not for her, but for all of them, the living and the dead, the guilty and the grieving, the broken and the slowly mending. For everyone who had survived the war, only to discover that surviving was the harder battle. The sea was too calm for a day of endings, but perhaps that was fitting, because this was not an ending. It was simply the moment when they stopped fighting long enough to remember they were human. And from that small, fragile moment, everything else would have to grow.